Hello, alumni and friends. Welcome to Teenage Development and Mental Health in COVID-19, a conversation with Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore and Professor John Palfrey, presented by Cambridge in America. On behalf of Cambridge in America, I hope you're all safe and well in these unusual times. We are glad you are joining us today. As you may know, Cambridge in America is the outpost in North America for the colleges and the university, handling alumni engagement, events, and fundraising. Part of our role is to help you connect with the university and your colleges, as well as with each other. Today, we have over 300 alumni and friends registered for this event, tuning in from around the world. Welcome again to those just joining us. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Your microphone and camera will be turned off throughout. This session will have a Q&A following the presentation. You are welcome to submit Q&A questions throughout the talk using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Our speakers will attempt to address as many questions as possible, but time is limited. We thank you in advance for your understanding if your question is not answered. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the Cambridge in America YouTube channel. We are fortunate to have two esteemed experts with us today who have made their lives work in education and the study of adolescence. Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore is Professor of Psychology at Cambridge and leader of the Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience Group. Her group's research focuses on the development of social cognition and decision-making in the human adolescent brain and adolescent mental health. Her group runs behavioral studies in schools and in the lab, as well as neuroimaging studies with adolescents and adults. You can find links to Professor Blakemore's latest book, Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain, in communications about this event. Joining her is Pembroke alumnus, Professor John Palfrey. John is president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, one of the nation's largest philanthropic organizations. Professor Palfrey is a well-respected educator, author, legal scholar, and innovator with expertise in how new media is changing learning, education, and other institutions. Professor Palfrey has published extensively on how young people learn in a digital era, as well as the effects of new technologies on society at large. A link to his latest book, The Connected Parent, an expert guide to parenting in a digital world, will be circulated following the event. Please join me in welcoming them both to screen, Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore and Professor John Palfrey.
Thank you so much to the Cambridge in America team and for all of those who have joined us today. My name is John Palfrey, and I have the great privilege of joining Professor Blakemore. I am coming to you from very wintry Chicago. Anybody who is in or near the Midwest knows that we've been in the midst of a very, very cold snap. It's sort of tundra-like. And actually, I'm in my office at MacArthur Foundation, downtown Chicago, for the very first time since March, because I wanted to ensure a very strong Wi-Fi connection to come to all of you. I will say that I'm wistfully thinking about the University of Cambridge, a place that I loved as a graduate student and have returned to several times. I accept all invitations to return back to Pembroke or other parts of Cambridge. And Sarah-Jayne, I'm just thrilled to be with you in this session. So thank you very much for making time. I realize it's probably dinner time or later for you in UK. Are you actually in Cambridge?
No, I'm not. I'm at home, which is in Hertfordshire, just next to Cambridge.
Very nice. Thank you for situating us in the world. But it's quite cool that we're able to do this separated by thousands of miles and joining many Cambridge graduates and families here today. So anyway, I'm just thrilled to be able to have this conversation. And it feels very fortunate from my end to be able to have this conversation along with somebody who is among the world's experts in how the teenage brain works and explaining that to all of us who are parents and those who care about kids one way or another. And turns out that we're both parents of teenagers. I have an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old in our house who've been suffering through this COVID period like everybody else and trying to figure out the best way through. And we're very lucky to have Sarah-Jayne as an expert both at Cambridge, which we can be proud of, but also here with us today to talk things through. So our topic is a broad one. Of course, it's looking at the way in which we think about teenagers in this era. And I know we're all struggling with questions about school, whether people should be in person in school or not. We're struggling with questions about whether we should let our kids socialize in person, knowing the health risks, of course, associated with COVID. We're struggling with how much time to let them be on their Xbox. And I suspect that we have Xboxes going in the background, if not other kinds of screens in many of our houses at exactly this moment to help get us through. But I wonder if before we get into the COVID era, Sarah-Jayne, if we might take a step back and just talk a little about your research more broadly. I know in your lab at Cambridge and UCL and elsewhere, you have been studying for a long time the social brain and the social mind of teenagers. And I wonder if you could just sort of back up a little bit. You are a great explainer, in my view, of the core tenets that come out of this extraordinary research. I think I may have been a 3,300,000th person to watch your TED Talk on this topic. But I wonder if you could just kind of ease us into the topic and give us a sense of the kind of hard questions that you stage brain as it develops and the important aspects of social life that are top of mind even before we get into the COVID topic.
Okay, so I'll try to do a brief summary. Thank you for that introduction, John. Okay, so I became interested in how the brain develops during adolescence because I did my PhD research here in London on schizophrenia, which is a psychiatric condition that is characterized by things like hearing voices and being really paranoid. And I did a load of research on schizophrenia, both in London and then during my postdoc in France. And I tested many patients in hospitals who had schizophrenia. And what struck me and what really interested me is the fact that whenever I asked these patients, hundreds of patients, when did you first start experiencing these symptoms? There wasn't a single exception. All of them said at some age between about 18 and 26. So that was my question back then. By the way, that was like 20 years ago now. What is it about teenage brain development that is different in teenagers who go on to develop schizophrenia compared with teenagers who don't? And to my surprise back then, 20 years ago, very little was known about teenage brain development in humans. There were a couple of papers and that was it. So at that point, to cut a long story short, I decided to change the focus of my own research. And ever since then, for the last 18 years, I've been studying the development of the teenage brain. And as you said, I've got a particular interest in my lab on the development of the social brain. That is the brain, the network of brain regions that we use to understand other people, to interact with the world, the social world around us. And there's many labs around the world who study the teenage brain, including the social brain, and all of that research, including ours, points to very substantial development across the whole of the cortex, the whole of the surface of the brain, including regions involved in social understanding and social interaction throughout childhood, but also throughout adolescence and even into the 20s and sometimes the early 30s. So contrary to what was previously believed, and if I go back further in time to my own undergraduate degree, which wasn't at Cambridge, it was at Oxford, I was taught, that was 25 years ago, I was taught that the human brain stops developing in childhood. That's what everyone assumed back then, back in the mid-90s, because back then we did not have the technology to look inside the living human brain. Now with technology like MRI scanners, we're able to track the human brain as it develops across the lifespan, both in terms of its structure and its function. And all that research, there's huge amounts of research. This field is massively expanded over the last 10, 20 years, has pointed to very protracted development in many brain regions, including the social brain.
That's amazing. There's so many things that we can dig in on, and look, I look forward to that in this next hour. I wonder, one of the things that you said glancingly, but which struck my attention, I think may have other parents as well, was the use of different ages here. And my sense is that this understanding of what adolescence really is defined by has actually changed, and whether or not that's changed because it has changed or because of our understanding has become clear. I'd be curious on that. But when does adolescence start? When does it end? What's and does that matter, in terms of the way we think about it as parents or educators?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, because I use the word all the time without thinking that people actually have very different definitions of this word. So when I first started working on adolescence, the main definition that I used and lots of my colleagues used was the period of life between puberty, so beginning at with the hormonal and physical changes of puberty, and ending at the able independent role in society. So the end of adolescence is defined socially and differs vastly between different cultures. Now, the reason why I'm saying I'm using the past tense to describe that is because a couple of years ago, there was a big paper in the Lancet published by some scholars who work on adolescence, Susan Sawyer and her colleagues, that argued that the world should redefine adolescence as the period of life between 10 and 24. And we should just stick with that age definition globally. And their argument was largely based on the fact, on this new research showing that the brain undergoes such substantial development between the ages of 10 and 24, and only starts to kind of stabilize out in the mid-20s. And I have absolutely embraced that definition. It makes it a lot easier, because then you don't have the problems of different cultures, societal expectations of young people. Of course, in some cultures like here, young people are not independent for a very long time. They live at home, they're in full-time education right throughout their teens, into their 20s, even 30s. And that's not the case for other cultures, where children are expected to become independent as soon as they can. So they're expected to earn money for their family as soon as they can. They're expected to have babies as soon as they reach sexual maturity. So those cultural differences are really, really interesting. And but in order to define adolescence and to do research globally on adolescence, I think it's really important to use the same definition. So age between 10 and 24.
All right, thank you. That's clearing something up in a very helpful way. I wonder if you could talk a little about the learning process that we are observing among young people during that period. So you wrote a book previously called The Learning Brain with a colleague and mentor I know to you, and you continue to study this process of how the actual learning happens for young people. And as we get to thinking about this COVID moment and the way that learning is occurring, you write a lot about nature and nurture, education and parenting and genes and so forth. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the what we all ought to know about the way in which this learning happens between the ages of 10 and 24 in the social way and otherwise.
Yeah, so I guess, well, this reminds me of so there are some really great questions being in the chat. They keep popping onto my screen in the chat. And the first question from Simon Bowden was really interesting about, I mean, I'm not going to go through all the questions now. We can leave that to the Q&A, but I think—
go for it. It's just as well to have the audience.
Getting at the same point, which he's saying about mental health in adolescence and how it's really complex. And we don't really understand why some adolescents have mental health struggles, mental health problems. And so there's no simple solution. And I completely agree. And actually, the way I would answer that question is exactly the way I'd answer the question that you just asked, John, which is, what contributes to all these changes that we go through in adolescence? And the answer is not simple at all. There are masses of changes going on all at the same time. So you go through puberty when you're in your late childhood, in your early teens. That itself, is a surge of sex hormones in your brain and your body, and they have very big effects on all sorts of things, not mostly the way you look. Suddenly you go from looking like a small child to looking more like an adult, and society treats you differently because of that. So that biological change of hormonal changes, of puberty changes, then triggers a social change, a social environmental change, where people start treating you differently. They give you more responsibility, more autonomy, and that can have, in good and bad ways. And
it's a feedback loop in essence.
It is a feedback loop, and equally with yourself, you see yourself differently. Suddenly, you're wondering more about how you look to other people and how other people are judging you. At the very same time, the brain undergoes huge amounts of transition and reorganization and development. And that goes on for many years, as I've already mentioned. And at the same time as that, and probably partly due to that, your cognitive abilities it's continue to develop, they continue to improve. So for example, cognitive abilities like executive functions, the ability to plan your actions, plan your time, to make decisions, to inhibit inappropriate behavior, also self-awareness and an understanding of other people's minds, really undergo quite profound change during the entire period of adolescence. And finally, yes, back to the social world. The social world changes, not just because you're looking different and people treat you differently, but also if you think about children in most countries go from small primary schools, elementary schools, I think they're called in the US, to much bigger secondary schools or middle schools where there are loads more people, loads more faces, the social hierarchies are unstable, the social world is very complex, and you're desperately trying to find your way around your social world at a time where your social world starts to matter to adolescents much more than they do to children. It's really important to kind of find your tribe, to work out, to affiliate with your peers, work out which peer group you're in. You're much more aware of what your peers think about you. You're much more likely to be influenced by your peers. Anyway, all of these things are happening at the very same time, both through genetic influences and, of course, masses of environmental change. It's very difficult to disentangle all of those different factors. So they're happening through all the time. And I think in some ways that's the way I would answer questions about mental health problems. There is no simple explanation to why there's a sudden increase in mental health problems in adolescence. I haven't mentioned this, and many of you will know, but about 3/4 of all mental health problems start in the period of adolescence. And we don't really know why, but I expect it's because there's a huge amount in the brain, the body, cognition, and the social environment that also makes it very difficult to solve the problem and to prevent mental health problems in the first place, or to treat them when they do happen, because you're dealing with multiple causal factors.
That's wonderful. And I think you answered Simon's question, but was there anything, if we were just hitting it straight on, is there anything else you'd want to say on that topic before we continue?
So he said there are no miracle solutions, and absolutely. I mean, if there was a miracle solution, we'd all be doing it, and there wouldn't be any mental health problems. There is none, and there's a lot of interest in mental health in adolescents, but actually that's really quite recent, and therefore, the research is only just starting now. So watch this space. In the next 10 or 20 years, I expect we'll discover a lot. But if I think about when I was at high school, or when you were at high school, no one talked about mental health or mental illness. It just wasn't discussed. Not to say mental health problems didn't exist. Oh yes, they did, but they didn't have terms. It was very stigmatized. There was no awareness. That has really, really changed, as anyone with children or anyone who works in schools knows. And now it's very well discussed, and perhaps that increased awareness is one of the reasons why we have seen, both in the UK and the US, a very significant increase in the reported rates of mental health problems, particularly things like depression, anxiety, self-harm, eating disorders, in the last 10 years. Maybe people are just more aware of it. It's less stigmatized, but actually, my clinical colleagues, I'm not clinical, but my child adolescent psychiatrist colleagues and clinical psychologist colleagues all say that, and there are some great papers I can put in the chat or something later on this, all say that over and above increased awareness and decreased stigma, they think there has been a real increase in the actual prevalence of those disorders. And so this is my point, that something has changed, if that's the case, in the last 10, 20 years. There must be ways of getting at that. What has changed in the world to cause this increase in mental health problems? There are lots of possibilities, but that's one way of thinking about solutions to the problem, to work out what's caused this increase.
That's an incredibly good question. I think it ties, even though it may not be exactly the core of our topic, at least the way we've described it, I think it is very close to the core, and it's illustrative of the kinds of things that we know and we don't know, right? And both in the underlying science, the kinds of things we suppose about social media in particular. A lot of people suppose that the growth in some of these harms, has to do with social media. There's no real evidence of that so far as I know, but it's certainly something there's a lot of supposition around, and maybe it will prove to be true, but doesn't happen to be proved yet. And to the point of solutions, the approaches therefore are emergent, and it's an application of lots of things, right? Like talk therapy and drugs and other things that we've applied for a long time, but we're still learning about it much more, right, than we've ever known before. My job before being president of MacArthur and after being a professor at Harvard Law School was as head of a school called Phillips Academy, which would be in the British context like an Eton or a Harrow or others, a boarding school for high school students, about 1,100 kids from all around the world. And I was struck by, over the course of that 7 years, the growth of focus, attention, time spent on mental health issues of our young people. We, as a high school, again, with 1,100 kids, we had 5 full-time psychologists in the context of Andover, which is an amazing thing, and only very rich schools, of course, could be able to do that. And those 5 full-time psychologists were more than booked up at all times. And as students were running for co-president for the last, I think, 3 or 4 years I was there, the #1 issue that they ran on was mental health at Andover. So it was basically saying we need to do more. And and adults were saying, like, have 5 full-time psychologists on staff. Like, what could we possibly do? But the answer was more. Like, we have to figure out other things to do. And in part, I think it's as maybe as puzzling, if not more puzzling, to those of us who are adults in this field to think about it. I wonder if I made some statements there. You may want to challenge or disagree, but I would want to make sure that what I said about social media, do you feel that the advent of social media and the additional use of technologies is the source of the problem in the rise in, say, anxiety, stress, suicidality, or eating disorders, the things that you listed, or part and parcel? What would be your sense?
Well, I wouldn't put it all down to that. I mean, I don't think the evidence is really strong enough that iPhones or screen time or social media have caused the increase in prevalence. On the other hand, it certainly might exacerbate it if you have if you're worried about your self-worth, what you look like, then it's not going to help looking at social media all the time where people are just commenting on what each other looks like. But I think, and also, well, I think maybe we get onto this later when we very soon turn to what you do. But I think there are probably multiple factors. And I think by just focusing on the possible harms of social media, we might neglect other important factors as well. And that's really dangerous. Yes. So other important factors might be, I mean, I don't know, because we really don't know. There just isn't enough research yet. But my guess is that in a lot of, certainly here, academic pressure has increased over the last 10, 20 years on young people. I can, elaborate on that, but I think I won't. I'll just list it. Also, I think working with young people a lot, having teenage children, and knowing a lot of teenagers, I think there are in existence when we were teenagers. So and this is possibly where social media and just internet comes in. So pressures about the future. So I'm talking about things like, the job market and the housing market, the housing ladder, and also even things like climate change. These are things that young people often worry about. When they're asked about what they're worried about, they will cite those things, which is interesting and slightly worrying, because I think that when we were teenagers, 30 years ago, we didn't so much think about what job, whether we were going to end up getting a job or buy a house. That just wasn't on our radar. But now, and equally, things like climate change, we're starting to get worried about that, but it wasn't this kind of existential threat that I think young people have absorbed now. And the absorption is partly from being constantly exposed to negative news online. So maybe we can now turn to you, and there's so many questions that I've been slightly glancing at.
I can see them in the chat. It's crazy. Yeah. Really, and Sarah-Jayne, while you do this, I'm jumping up and down because the light has gone off my office, just so you know. That's what I'm doing. So you start. There you go. Sorry.
Mine does that in my office.
I was so badly backlit. Anyway.
But yeah, so maybe we can turn to you, and there are just so many questions here about screen time. And I mean, we all have questions about screen time generally, but in particular currently in this pandemic, because like in the US, here in the UK, schools are closed right now, and kids are spending all their time on screens. I mean, many hours for work, for their schoolwork, for homework, and then for their social life. It's all screen based. So let's start with that. What's your view on that? I mean, especially because I read your book, it's really great, The Connected Parent, and I felt, you know, it's so interesting and so informative and really evidence-based. That's what I loved about it. But I felt like it was really poignant, the chapter that you had where you were recommending, based on evidence, the limits on screen time per kind of age bracket of toddler, young child, adolescent. And I thought all that has gone completely out the window right now. I mean, needs must, but should we worry about that?
Yeah, I do worry about that. And I appreciate you raising it and also looking at the book. Thank you. In The Connected Parent, the idea for the book was basically to take the research that we thought was the best out there, whether we had done it or someone else had done it, and apply it to the questions we had heard most commonly from parents. And I would say, at least in the United States, almost always the questions start with screen time. Should we have a limit on the screen time for kids? And what should it be? And the short answer to that is yes, I think parents should set limits on kids in general. And different limits are appropriate for different ages. And importantly, certain limits are possible at certain ages. Now, what ended up being possible before COVID is really different than what's possible in COVID. And that is for sure problematic. It's pretty clear from those who study the youngest kids, and particularly in the United States, we cite to the American Academy of Pediatrics, which has revised its definitions to your point about what we continue to learn. But the basic idea is for an infant, there is no benefit to baby Einstein in the background. In fact, it's probably a negative. So beyond, what we recommend is if it's about connecting to grandparents over, Zoom or Skype or FaceTime, great. Beyond that, don't do it, at a super early age. And then, set some limits. As kids go up, and we set different levels based on ages, and again based on what the research is, and the experiences that we've heard from parents and so forth. By the time kids get up into the middle of adolescence, as I think we all know, the limits no longer work. They don't work because kids can work around them. They don't work because kids have all sorts of devices and mechanisms, right? And so at that point, what you're working with are the good habits that you've developed, right, all the way along. And I think that's where the kind of role of parents and mentors and teachers are going along. You write a ton about peer values. So who is in their peer set? How are they spending their time? What are the kinds of things, what are the other kinds of limits other than just saying a couple hours a day? Now, as you say, in COVID, all that is out the window. There, for most of us, certainly I can say for my two kids, again, 18 and 15, they are online all day, more or less, because it's where class is. It's the only way they can connect back. And I would love to end this statement with a question, if I can, for you on that topic. Of course, some of it is just, they're bored and they're inside and they can't do other things. It's a pandemic. The frustrating answer to the obvious question is we have no idea what the longer term effect of this is going to be. It's an unfortunate natural experiment. We should need to note also that, there are important divides here that we are learning from. So fact is, in the city of Chicago, where I'm based, about 1 in 5 kids couldn't even access school last spring when it went online because they didn't have access to the technology, right? And they didn't have a way to learn at all. So I think the impact on the highly connected kids and rich kids like my kids, that's going to be one thing. There also is going to be learning loss, for kids who are on the other side of the digital divide. There are all these issues, I think, that are going to play out. But one thing, if I could, and I know you're flipping the questions to me, but I'm going to flip one to you. When I was reading your recent book, or current book, the Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain, which everybody should read, you have this line when you're talking about the social mind and the social brain: imagine what life would be like without access to social experiences, page 97. And that jumped out at me, of course, because what my kids are experiencing right now is life without social experiences, at least the kind that is, face-to-face. Their schools have been remote. We are strict parents about COVID. They're not actually seeing other kids, and it is really hard. And all those mental health issues, they're all in play. And I'm just curious how you think about social life and the social mind in this COVID period. The noting, on the one hand, we're worried about screen time. On the other hand, we're worried about the social and emotional development of kids. And the only supplement, or the only way to do it safely for much of this period, of course, is over devices, whether that's a Zoom or a other thing. How do you think about that as a researcher, and maybe as a parent, if you're willing? Is it better to take the risk of additional screen time, knowing that the downside of this is huge social and emotional challenge for kids?
It's exactly the right question to ask, and lots of people are asking those kinds of questions.
Okay.
So when the pandemic first started here, when the lockdown was first started almost 1 year ago and schools were shut, my colleagues Amy Orben and Livia Tomova and I thought, my God, we really have to write a paper about this, because, well, to cut a long story short, we had already, by kind of coincidence, been planning a study to look at the effect of social isolation, short bursts of social isolation, on brain and cognition in adolescents. Because interestingly, there's a lot of work on that in animals, so in mice and rats, who go through about 30 days of adolescence. There's a lot of research over the last 40 years looking at how social isolation affects brain development and cognitive development in rodents in their adolescence. And what that research shows is that social isolation has more damaging effects and unique effects on brain development and cognitive processing and even mental health, compared with the same social isolation either prior to adolescence or in adulthood. Anyway, there are not any human studies looking at that for ethical reasons, but we think we can get around that, because just having small bursts of social isolation. Anyway, we had been discussing this. We'd been applying for funding, applying for ethics for a long time before the pandemic started. And so as soon as it started, we thought, gosh, this is just, as you just called it, a kind of horrible natural experiment where adolescents are being socially isolated. And so we were writing this paper, and Amy Orben, as some of you may know, is an expert on social media and well-being in adolescence. And we're writing this paper thinking, well, actually, I mean, the young children and young people and adults, we are being deprived of face-to-face social interaction, but we're not deprived of online interaction like this. Now, they're very different, but perhaps online, connecting with your friends online will mitigate some of the potentially harmful effects of the deprivation of face-to-face social interaction. And so we wrote this paper. It was published in The Lancet actually last June, so quite a long time ago now, still very relevant. And our main conclusion was that, so at least social media enables young people and adults, but particularly young people, because they need it so much, to connect with their friends, to have some kind of lifeline to their friends. And so, yes, I mean, you asked my view as a parent. I actually, for the first time in the last year, encourage my children to get online and connect with their friends, even if it means, and there's Nigel Lake's asked a question about, the social elements of gaming, even those kind of shooting games. Yeah, I mean, they can be very social. And one of my sons plays those games, and it lifts his mood when he's done that, because he's had a great social interaction with a couple of his friends from school who he hasn't seen for months face to face. Yeah, so I think the way I think of it is, imagine that we'd had this pandemic 30 years ago when we were teenagers. I mean, it would have been completely different, and probably, I don't know, it's impossible to know, but possibly more damaging, because we had no way of connecting with friends back then other than a landline phone, which was expensive and
long distance calls, right?
Yeah, exactly. So on the other hand, I do worry about how children are spending literally 10 hours looking at a screen, and I worry about that on many levels, but mostly their eyesight and our eyesight. I think there's probably nothing good about staring at a screen for 10 hours a day for any of us, and
the incredible arthritic hands we're going to have from using these devices, and
kind of thing, and the lack of physical exercise, and maybe
terrible.
Yeah, and I'm sitting on a yoga ball right now. For that.
You're so good. You're so good.
And and also, of course, there are harms, and you do talk about that in your book. There are potential harms, and what I try not to do is just allow my children to go off and be online all day without kind of some checking up on what they're and talking to them about what they're looking at and who they're connecting with, and constant kind of education about, and that they know more than I do, because they get so many great lessons at school about the potential harms and dangers of the internet and who's out there and what you should and shouldn't do. I think, you know, and what you might see. I mean, it's not hard to see some pretty awful stuff. But I think my solution to that, like, it's just not, it's a problem and it's not going to go away. So the way I deal with that is just constantly educating them about, yeah, what they might see and what it means and what it doesn't mean. And what about you?
Very similar. You know, it's interesting. You talk about the games. You know, I'm sort of as a parent, I'm okay with gaming. I don't do spend a lot of time myself doing it, but I know other researchers love gaming in their kids and think it's wonderful. And I don't think games have these terrible problems. I also don't think they're the solution to education as some people do. So I maybe I'm a moderate on this topic, but it's fascinating for you to say you are encouraging for the first time, you know, this kind of gaming. And of course, gaming interfaces have all of these dynamics of social media, right? They are interactive, they are peer-based and so forth. They also, you know, are the chats in games are places where people who want to do harm to our kids can get them. So it has all of those elements to it. And, you know, the rule in our household has been gaming is fine, certain limits, but we allow no first-person shooter games. So our thinking was we didn't want a game in which somebody was shooting at somebody else as the identity that you were taking on. Now, this is not a research-based premise, right? The research is not clear on this, saying like it leads to more aggression or whatever in kids, but it's just the kind of the rule that we set. But it is interesting to hear different decision, you know, with all of these different variables there, and you know, that's certainly consistent with how we've struggled with this. But the chat is so good. I just caught my eye this question from Laura Feldman about is family time and peer teen socializing a decent substitution for peers. And on the same topic, you know, in our house, that's all they got. They've got their parents and themselves as teens. And the answer in our house is absolutely not. Like we try super hard. We do a lot of family time and lots of meals together and all that kind of stuff. But the answer is not even close. But I am curious if you see it differently, or if you think maybe is there a ray of hope there for parents in any way that can be helpful? And my hunch is no, but you're really the expert on teen interaction.
Well, I think I would answer that more generally. So this would apply outside the pandemic as well, which is that young people, that they have a kind of motivation, a drive to affiliate with their peers. They need to do that because the point of adolescence is to come out the other side as an independent adult, independent from your parents, from your families. So you need to go out, you need to take risks, to explore your environment, to try new things, to move away gradually from your families. Now that can be really hard as a parent. You don't want your little kid to push you away and push back against what you're suggesting, but actually that's probably very adaptive for them, and they need to do it to become an independent adult at the other side. But so I often say that, and I think, you know, that's partly the reason why adolescents, for example, take more risks. And that's true, by the way, not just for human adolescents, but for other species of animal. It's true across cultures, it's true across history. There's something about adolescence which is associated with an increased propensity to take risks. It's also associated with an increased likelihood of being influenced by peers, especially in the context of risk-taking, but not only in the context of risk-taking, in the context of all sorts of behaviors, even things like pro-social behaviors, like volunteering or donating to charity. But I'm often asked, well, then, you know, what do parents, like, what's the point of parents? But parents are so important for adolescents, even though adolescents might act like they don't want to know that you are wrong and they're right, and that they're just basically embarrassed by you, or certainly are very embarrassed by me. I've got lots of funny stories about that.
They'd love this recording, I'm sure.
Yeah, that is the most embarrassing thing, having a mum who works on the teenage break.
It must be great.
But you know, actually adults are so important, and particularly parents for teenagers. And that's because even though teenagers look like adults, I mean, my boys are both taller than me now, and they wear adult clothes and they're very much adult looking, but they don't have adult brains yet, and their abilities to you know, make decisions and plan and think about the future and think about counterfactual reasoning, all of that is still ongoing in terms of its development. They have a long way to go. The brain doesn't stop developing until at least the mid-20s. There are lots of individual differences. And And so, you know, parents are just as important during the teenage years to scaffold and support that teenage development and that adolescent development as parents are in the early years, in the toddler years, in every way. So in some ways, you know, this pandemic just really highlights that when you're locked away in your houses, that's all there is, the family. And I mean, as you mentioned before, John, that the problem is that this pandemic has really amplified inequalities in society. Where in our society, I think like yours, inequalities were already far too broad, and now they've just become, you know, just horrible and massively amplified, both in terms of learning, the amount of learning acquired and teaching. Like you said, lots of children don't have laptops, Wi-Fi at home, the space to work, quiet, supportive home environments working, and others do, and they're now, not, it's just impossible to compare those in terms of their educational attainment. But also we know that, I mean, just to move on to kind of horrible things, we know that there are homes that aren't safe for children, and school is the kind of safety net there for those homes. That's their safe space for those children. They're getting fed at school and they're being looked out for, and that's not happening right now. There's a real concern amongst pediatricians. I work with lots of pediatricians in this country about that problem.
I'll give a lot of credit to the Chicago Public Schools in one way here, that even as they shut down, they made sure that the meal service continued for exactly this reason, and they just kept open, you know, places for everybody to get. It's obviously not a substitute for everything, but interesting policy decision, and underscored, you know, all these things that our institutions, you know, provide for families. This brings up one of the questions in the chat that Kendra Foley mentions about wealth inequality and the mental health disorders that we were talking about before. And this is something that is often discussed here in the United States, and sort of a presumption that some, for eating disorders as an example, are a sign of affluenza, that you know, tend to be more among the more affluent populations. I don't know if you know, is there any data to show that, other than the sort of common perception that you know, those of us who are better off tend to see more of it?
You know what? I think that's a bit of a myth. And the more recent, I was taught that when I did psychology at university, but the more recent big epidemiological studies, surveys in lots of different countries of which follow very large longitudinal cohorts as they grow up and get older, well, they find that the biggest explanatory factor, the biggest risk factor for mental health problems, particularly depression and anxiety, is poverty. So this idea that disorders or conditions like self-harm and depression and eating disorders, I'm not so sure about, but this idea that they are a kind of a symptom of affluence, I don't think that there's much evidence for that. But of course, affluent people, of course, can suffer and do suffer from those conditions, but poverty shouldn't be left out of the equation. Poverty is a big risk factor for mental health problems in adolescence. And someone else brought that up in the chat, actually. They said that, you know, we should not forget about poverty and austerity, and that's absolutely right.
Absolutely. We've sort of pivoted, I think, here into question and response, and there's so many great ones. I'm seeing 43 questions here that we'll, of course, never get to in the next 10 minutes or so. But do you want to pick one either to answer yourself or pitch over to me?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a couple while you maybe have a look through.
I'll have a browse. Okay, sounds good. Going on mute. Yeah.
So someone asked about gender differences. I have not mentioned gender differences, but I will tell you a couple of things. First of all, there are some gender differences in adolescence, as you might imagine, and I will just pick up a couple of them, which I've already mentioned, and that is puberty and mental illness. So puberty, on average, occurs a couple of years, or 1 or 2 years earlier, on average, in girls relative to boys. So girls go through puberty earlier than boys. And also, girls, the rates of mental health problems like depression and anxiety are different in girls and boys. So girls experience all sorts of mental health problems like depression and anxiety, eating disorders, self-harm at a much greater rate than boys do in their early teens. And that might be partly because of the earlier puberty onset. Maybe for both biological and social reasons. So biologically, we know that estrogen, the sex hormone that increases hugely at the start of puberty in girls, does have an effect on mood, for example. But also, like I mentioned right at the beginning, going through puberty early has social consequences. Suddenly, you look different, you think of yourself differently, society treats you differently, you become more aware of what you're supposed to look like, the ideal body shape or whatever for girls and women, and you maybe become more worried about it. And also we know that girls who go through puberty earlier than their peers have a heightened risk of depression in their early adolescence. That doesn't mean that all girls who go through puberty early will get depressed, of course not, but there's a slight increase in the risk. So those two gender differences are really quite well established. What is less well established are gender differences in brain development and cognitive development. There seem to be some, but actually what I'd say here, rather than going into lots of detail, is that there's a huge amount of overlap between the genders. And so in other words, there may be some overall slight differences, but largely the genders overlap in terms of their brain development and their cognitive development.
That is so good. And so many more questions I could ask about that, but we should keep answering some of the ones from the chat because they're so good too. Kirsten Denker asked a follow-up question to the gaming one that we were on about monitoring what our kids are doing. She says, how do you monitor which games your kids are playing? I also hate first-person shooters, but my 16-year-old definitely plays them. So I would answer that similarly to the way I did with screen time, which is it's much easier to control with the younger kids, obviously, than the older kids. And there's a point at which you can't control exactly. And I would say there really were two principal controls that we use. One is money. So we wouldn't buy those games. And, we were open to buying lots of other kinds of games, the Lego type games and the, Harry Potter, and so the ones that did, they had some excitement to them, but they weren't sort of classic first-person shooters. And then the sporting ones, which are the most popular ones, at least with our son. And our daughter actually is not that interested in gaming, so it was more on the son side. And number two, other than the money, was just sort of participating, monitoring, being a part of his life. And so this gets a really interesting kind of balance, of course, which is we know that adolescents need time on their own. They need doors closed. They need to be able to do whatever they do outside of our view, totally necessarily. On the other hand, they need us in their life. And as you said, Sarah-Jayne, they don't necessarily always admit to that, but they do. And so finding the right amount of monitoring and surveillance effectively, so that we're helping them make good decisions, particularly up until, whatever, maybe 18, it becomes hard to do. But so to Kirsten's question, no perfect answer, but some combination of the power of the purse and the power of our presence in their lives. But I don't know if you would answer that differently, or you had any comments on the sort of, invasion of privacy type concerns that I'm sure many parents wonder about.
It is such a tricky one. And it's basically, I find like a battle that you're never going to win, because they'll find a way to do things privately. So we just, like you say, we just try to be very open and talk about things and ask questions, but without invading privacy too much. I think it's really important for young people to have some privacy.
Rory Chambers asked us also in the chat about privacy from companies and so forth. I don't know if you saw that one. Does that, from a developmental perspective, does that bother you at all, the sort of the increased privacy and surveillance not by us as parents, but by by third parties?
Well, there's all sorts of things, and you talk about this a lot in your book. There's all sorts of things that worry me, and again, I just constantly talk about this with my kids. Like, for example, anything you put online, anything you make public, there's going to be a trace. It's impossible to get rid of that trace in the internet, so just be super careful there. But the thing is, in some ways, I don't know whether anyone else finds this, but I find my children a bit less naive about that kind of thing than I am.
Yeah.
Because I'm always shocked when things from 10 years ago are still online. whereas they've grown up with the internet and they've had lessons about the internet since they were 6 at school, and they know full well that that's the case. And I mean, that's not to say that I'm really talking about my kids, but teenagers in general, that's not to say that in the heat of the moment, when there's a lot of peer pressure, they wouldn't, it's natural for them to succumb sometimes to that peer pressure and do something silly like put up a photo that they regret or write something that they regret. Of course, I mean, that we know that, but there's, there is not much you can do apart from just constantly educate them about the potential harms and the potential regrets. I think that's absolutely right. I wanted to answer a question. Firstly, there just made me laugh. I found someone say that Caitlin says, this is not a question, but I love the color scheme of your books. Someone was asking about criminal justice system and whether this newish science showing that the brain develops for a much longer period of time than we previously thought, whether that has implications for the criminal justice system. And I think, yes, it does. And actually, yes, it already has. So in the US, for example, Larry Steinberg is a very, very well-known pioneer of adolescent development research. And he has worked very hard and extensively with the Supreme Court and all sorts of legal cases to make this argument. And there was, back in, I think, 2005, the Supreme Court, its policy on the death penalty for minors, because prior to that, to 2005, the death penalty could be given to minors. And a bunch of people, including Larry Steinberg, argued that partly due to the new, by the way, then in 2005 it was very new, science of brain development in teenagers, that shouldn't be allowed, and they did overturn that. So I think now it's not possible to give the death penalty to minors. And even and there were some other changes in the US law based partly, not completely, but partly on neuroscience, and the big proponent of that was Larry Steinberg. In the UK, one of the issues is the age of criminal responsibility. I don't know if you call it that in the US, but in the UK, children get treated as adults in court, believe it or not, but at the age of 10. So the criminal responsibility the age of criminal responsibility in the UK is 10. That is much, much younger than in most other countries in the world. Actually, this is England and Wales. Scotland, it's now 12. In the US, I think it might be 14 or even 15. And the average age around the world is 14 or 15. And in Europe, it's more like 15 or 16. So many of us who work with adolescents are constantly lobbying for the age of criminal responsibility to be increased, because there is no evidence whatsoever that a 10-year-old's brain or even cognitive capacity to understand the consequences of their actions and to think about the future are anywhere near adult. So yes, the answer is this research does have relevance to the criminal justice system, I think.
Absolutely, very powerful. And that is obviously, that's a place where research is making a difference in terms of life or death, right? And huge impact around the world. I might just pick up on a couple of questions that look at games and physical exercise and so forth. I'll give a pretty non-scientific answer, and if you want to take it after me, Sarah-Jayne, that'd be great. But several people, Sean Peck and others, said, talk about the games that families can play that help the teenage brain develop and so forth. And one of the things I argue in The Connected Parent with my co-author Urs Gasser is that device-free time is very important, and this predates COVID, but I think it's super important, and I suspect many of us are parents who are expert in kicking our kids outside to play soccer, or ride a bike, or take a walk, or whatever they're able to do or interested in doing without devices. But also, games, physical puzzles, reading physical books, things like cribbage, bridge, and chess, which came up in another person's note. I brought back some of those games to our kids in a way that makes them laugh, old-fashioned games, but I think they do get a kick out of it, and it is a positive thing. And I think there are absolutely benefits to the tactile to the physical, and certainly in terms of physical exercise and education that comes from exerting our bodies that we know relate to our brain, right? And this is maybe where I'll hand it off, because I don't want to go in an area I don't understand, other than to believe that there is such a connection. But if you wanted to take up any of that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we also over the past year, we always played a lot of board games, but over the past year we've played more because there's nothing else to do. I mean, now my teenagers are so bored because they can't see their friends, that they actually ask to play board games with me, which I never thought. I do think, it's great, but it's also kind of sad. They should be out doing what teenagers do with their friends, not playing board games with their mum on a Friday night. But yeah, we play lots of board games, and I mean, loads of board games are really focused on strategy and all sorts of skills and abilities that are developing in adolescence. But having said that, they always beat me, so I think
that's also good.
It starts deteriorating at some point as well. Shall we end by trying to focus on some positives? So lots of people have asked, there's a lot of negativity around the pandemic, and there certainly is, and that we don't want to underplay the real serious concerns. I mean, I would call it a crisis. COVID is a crisis, and that's a horrendous. I mean, here, we have this new variant, and we've had a horrendous winter. But at the same time, there are other crises that are going on, and one of them is to children, the lack of learning, the lack of education, but also the lack of social interaction. We worry about that a lot, but what are the positives? Can you, and also maybe I could ask you about positives about screens and social media and the internet.
Absolutely. I think I'm grateful for the opportunity to see it in another light, and just I embrace all the concerns that you noted, which are crucial as a starting point. And in this era, I think we are seeing people of all ages, including young people, including teenagers, step up and do amazing things. And some of that is finding ways to help in their community, whether that's making turkey and cheese sandwiches and bringing them to the people who need more to eat than ever before, and being involved directly in meeting human needs, coming up with clever ways, using the internet and otherwise, to advocate for various things. I think there's a sense that this generation coming along is more apathetic or less likely to vote or something. It's just simply not true. At least in the United States, the data suggests we're reaching 50-year highs in terms of engagement in community, and the kinds of activism that we see students taking to the street, whether it's on climate or Black Lives Matter, otherwise. So I actually think that is part and parcel of the moment we're in. The challenges are bigger, the times are greater, and in times of crisis, whether it's World War II in Britain, or it's the Great Depression all around the world, or it's COVID, I think people do step up and do things, and I see a lot of that around us, and young people, and I really celebrate that. And actually, the technology is not a negative in that way. I don't believe in this idea of clicktivism. It's just that kids click on a Facebook page and then they're done. Those tend to lead to other kinds of positive forms of engagement. So I think we're going to see a bunch of positive things, particularly just to stick with this kind of civic activism engagement in the world, that will hopefully carry us through on things like climate, that we do need multilateral, we do need solutions that engage everybody all around the world. And I'm grateful that we're at a place where we can see some of that. But how about you, Sarah-Jayne? How do you maybe you can end for us on some positives?
I think there are huge individual differences, but I think for some young people, so for some young people, this has been a very difficult time. This is a very difficult time, and they're really suffering because of social isolation, or because they have difficult home environments. But I think we mustn't forget that for a lot of children, young people, they're dealing with it amazingly well, and they're being really resilient to this huge trauma, really, in their lives that no one expected. No one, that's an amazing thing for the ones who are coping well, to have gone through this and coped with it could in the end be a very positive thing. Other things like, someone mentioned is a slower life better? I think for some children it might be. We do tend to get our kids to do too much like after school activities, weekend activities, sports clubs, drama clubs, whatever it might be, just pushing them constantly to do as much as possible. Having that all taken away from them is a bit sad, but it's also maybe made us reflect a bit on whether it's necessarily a good thing. Also sleep, I think probably, I saw a graph the other day from some recent data, it wasn't actually on kids, but showing that people, interestingly, are having more sleep now than they were a year ago, and it's gradually increased. And that can be no bad thing. Sleep, teenagers tend to be quite sleep deprived. They can get a bit more sleep during this pandemic. That's probably not a bad thing for their brain and cognitive development.
Absolutely. If the trade-off between not getting on buses or getting to school is that they invest in that in sleep, that would be a good positive. Well, thank you, Sarah-Jayne. It's been fun to spend some time with you in this session. And I just want to, on behalf of Cambridge alumni the world around, including the United States, thank you for the work you're doing, making us proud to be connected to the university. And I hope all of us will pitch in to support the great work that's happening and that you all are leading. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, John.
Thank you, John, for those concluding thoughts to this important conversation. And thank you, Sarah-Jayne, for your thought-provoking insights and research. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of either Professor Blakemore's or Professor Palfrey's books, the links to an online retailer will be circulated to attendees after the event concludes. On behalf of Cambridge in America, thank you all for joining us today and for being vital members of our Cambridge community. We look forward to continuing to connect with you, for now in a digital capacity, and hope to see you at future events. Thank you.